For centuries, history books have celebrated kings and conquerors, but behind the glory lies a story rarely told. The world of black slaves, 50 facts of lost brilliance, beasts unleashed, torture as routine, and forced labor building empires. Before whips and chains, West Africa dazzled with gold, libraries, and kingdoms, richer than most of Europe. But everything changed overnight. More than 12 million people were stolen and packed onto ships, their lives sold for profit, their pain measured in insurance claims. What happens when a scholar like Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, is traded as cargo? In the next 18 minutes, you'll discover how these millions endured, resisted, and why their fight haunts our world today. Gold caravans crossed the Sahara, their camels loaded with salt, ivory, and rare manuscripts. In the heart of West Africa, the city of Timbuktu rose as a beacon of learning and trade. By the early 1300s, the Mali Empire stretched across thousands of miles, its wealth measured not just in gold, but in knowledge. Mansa Musa, the empire's most famous ruler, set out on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. He traveled with a retinue so vast and with so much gold that markets from Cairo to Medina were flooded, causing gold's value to plummet for years. Stories of his generosity and splendor spread across continents, drawing mapmakers to place Mali at the center of their world. Within Timbuktu's walls, scholars gathered from as far as Cairo and Granada. The city's libraries overflowed with hundreds of thousands of handwritten manuscripts covering law, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and poetry. At the Sankore University, students debated the works of Aristotle, discussed the stars, and preserved histories in Arabic and local languages. Trade routes connected Mali to Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, exchanging not only goods, but ideas. Salt, more precious than gold, traveled south from the desert, while gold and kola nuts moved north. Merchants, diplomats, and scholars all passed through the city's gates, adding to its cosmopolitan air. The Kingdom of Congo, further south, developed its own complex bureaucracy, minting currency, and maintaining diplomatic ties with Portugal. Across these lands, artisans crafted intricate bronzes, weavers produced rich textiles, and farmers cultivated rice, millet, and yams with advanced irrigation systems. These societies were not isolated villages, but networks of cities, kingdoms, and empires, each with their own courts, laws, and schools. Before the arrival of European slavers, West Africa stood as a center of wealth, intellect, and culture, brilliance that would soon face unimaginable loss. Ayuba Suleiman Diallo was born to privilege along the banks of the Gambia River. The son of a Muslim cleric, he mastered Arabic, memorized the Quran, and carried himself as a scholar and merchant. In 1731, Diallo set out to sell 2 enslaved people to English traders. Instead, betrayal awaited him. Local raiders seized Diallo and a companion, binding their hands and delivering them to the very traders he had hoped to bargain with. Within days, he was sold at the river's edge, no longer a merchant, but a commodity. His journey took him through the narrow, airless cells of a coastal fort, where the air reeked of fear and sweat. These stone dungeons, built by Europeans along Africa's Atlantic rim, processed thousands each year. Guards herded captives through iron-barred corridors, separating families and stripping away names, languages, and status. At the water's edge, Diallo was forced through a heavy wooden gate facing the sea. For those who passed through, there was no return. Loaded onto a British slave ship, Diallo crossed the Atlantic in chains. He landed in Maryland, stripped of his identity and forced to labor in tobacco fields. Yet through every humiliation, his name erased, his prayers mocked, he clung to memory and faith. Diallo's story was not unique. In those years, tens of thousands fell to similar fates, snatched from cities and villages, scholars and farmers alike. Each abduction sent ripples through families, towns, and empires, unraveling centuries of culture and learning. The loss was not just personal, but civilizational. The scholar became a slave, and the world he left behind began to fracture. On the far side of the ocean, a machinery of profit and suffering was waiting, one that would grind down millions, but never fully erase the memory of what had been stolen. Elmina Castle stands on the coast of present-day Ghana, its whitewashed walls rising above the Atlantic surf. Built by the Portuguese in 1482, the fort was first a trading post for gold. By the 17th century, it had become a holding cell for human lives. Captives arrived from the interior, dragged for miles in iron shackles, their wrists raw and voices hoarse from crying out for lost family. Once inside, they were herded into stone dungeons beneath the castle's grand halls. The air in these cells was thick with the stench of sweat and despair. Light barely pierced the gloom, and the only sound was the shuffle of bodies pressed together, waiting for ships that might not come for weeks. Guards separated men from women, breaking the last threads of kinship. Children vanished into the darkness, their names replaced by numbers. Above the dungeons, European traders dined and slept in comfort, their windows overlooking the sea. Some traders built private ladders, descending at night to select enslaved women for abuse. The walls of the dungeons still bear marks from centuries of chains. When the ships finally arrived, the process was swift and methodical. Captives were forced through a narrow doorway at the back of the fort. Known as the Door of No Return, this opening faced directly onto the surf. Beyond it, only the horizon and the rolling Atlantic. Each person stepped through, leaving behind land, language, and everything they had known. The noise of the waves drowned out final goodbyes. For those who passed through, there was no promise of seeing home again. Elmina was just one among more than 40 slave forts along the West African coast. Hundreds of thousands were processed through its gates alone. The Door of No Return became a symbol, not just of physical departure, but of the first stage in erasing identity. Once aboard the waiting ships, captives would face a new ordeal. But the severing began here, as the last view of Africa slipped away behind a heavy wooden door. Slave ships left the coast loaded with bodies, stacked side by side in spaces barely 2 feet high. Men were chained together below deck, forced to lie flat in darkness for weeks. Women and children were separated to the stern, sometimes left unchained, but just as exposed to abuse. The air inside the hold grew thick with heat, sweat, and the stench of sickness. Buckets for waste overflowed within hours. Dysentery, smallpox, and fever swept through the decks. On some voyages, 1 out of every 5 people died before reaching land. In the early 1700s, the average mortality rate hovered around 18%. Later, it would fall, but never enough to erase the risk. For the traders, death was a cost of doing business. Captives were insured as cargo, not as people. The Zong, a British slave ship in 1781, became infamous for turning this logic into horror. When water ran low, Captain Luke Collingwood ordered 132 enslaved Africans thrown overboard. The ship's owners later claimed insurance for their loss, arguing it was necessary to save the rest. In court, the lives lost were compared to horses dumped at sea. The jury agreed, awarding compensation for the murdered captives. Profit demanded that every inch of space was filled, every ration stretched. Captives received meager food, often spoiled or infested with insects. Water was rationed so tightly that dehydration became as deadly as disease. Some captives tried to starve themselves in protest. Crew members sometimes smashed out teeth and forced food down their throats. Others chose the only escape left, jumping overboard into the Atlantic, preferring the unknown to what waited on the other side. Resistance was constant, even in chains. Mutinies broke out on roughly 1 in every 10 voyages. In the French port of Nantes alone, records show 70 ships faced revolt between 1715 and 1777. Violence met violence, as crews used whips, shackles, and guns to keep order. Sometimes, to make an example, a captain would cut off limbs or kill a captive in front of the others. By the time the ships reached the Americas, survivors had endured weeks in a floating coffin. Bodies were broken, families scattered, and spirits battered by a system that measured value in pounds, not in lives. Yet even as the ships anchored in new ports, the machinery of profit and cruelty was only beginning. Sugarcane fields stretched across Louisiana, demanding backbreaking labor from sunrise to sunset. The work never paused. Cane had to be cut, hauled, and crushed in the mill within a day, or the crop would spoil. In these fields, enslaved men, women, and children swung machetes for hours, their hands blistered and backs bent. The heat was relentless, but the pace never slowed. Once the cane reached the boiling house, danger only increased. Massive iron kettles, each 6 feet across, bubbled with scalding syrup. Workers faced furnace temperatures, their bodies pressed close to the steam. Accidents were common. Limbs caught in machinery, burns from splattering syrup. Injuries meant little to overseers focused on speed and profit. The sugar industry in Louisiana was notorious for its brutality. Between 1790 and 1810, as many as 20,000 Africans were brought directly to New Orleans to meet the demand for labor. Most would never see freedom. Mortality rates soared, but planters simply bought more people to replace the dead. On the Carolina and Georgia coasts, rice plantations turned swamps into gold. Enslaved Africans, chosen for their expertise, built intricate irrigation dikes and flooded fields by hand. Their knowledge made fortunes for their captors, but the work itself was deadly. Malaria, exhaustion, and drowning claimed countless lives. Tobacco fields in Virginia and Maryland required constant tending. Children as young as 5 picked worms from leaves, while adults hoed rows under the watchful eyes of overseers. Each region had its own crop, but the pattern was the same: forced labor, endless hours, and violence lurking behind every order. The wealth flowing from these fields built cities, funded banks, and filled the coffers of merchants on both sides of the Atlantic. But for the enslaved, every dollar earned meant another day of toil, another family torn apart, another life reduced to numbers on a ledger. Slave codes reached deep into every corner of daily life, spelling out what enslaved people could and could not do. These laws stripped away even the most basic rights. No marriages recognized, no property allowed, no testimony accepted in court. In South Carolina, a single law book listed dozens of offenses punishable by whipping, branding, or death. The threat of separation hung over every family. Children could be sold away at any moment, husbands and wives torn apart with the stroke of a pen. Owners wielded total power, using the law as both shield and weapon. But domination didn't stop at the law. It invaded the body. In the nation's capital, the Statue of Freedom rose above the Capitol Dome in 1863. The man who made it possible was Philip Reed, an enslaved ironworker. Reed's skill was so essential that his owner agreed to pay him for working Sundays, $1.25 a day for 33 Sundays. That was the only pay Reed ever received for helping cast a symbol of liberty atop the seat of American government. On southern plantations, the abuse took other forms. Dr. J. Marion Sims, now called the father of gynecology, built his reputation by performing experimental surgeries on enslaved women. Lucy, Anarcha, Betsy, these were just 3 of the women subjected to more than 30 operations, all without anesthesia. Sims claimed these women felt less pain. In reality, they had no right to refuse, no legal protection, and no voice. Their suffering was written out of medical journals, their names nearly erased. The machinery of slavery enforced obedience through fear, but it also relied on the erasure of personhood. Every law, every act of violence, every theft of labor or body aimed to make resistance seem impossible. Yet the stories of Philip Reed and the women in Sims's clinic show something else. Even in the heart of the system, people found ways to endure, to create, and to remember. The system demanded silence, but memory survived. Night fell heavy over the German coast of Louisiana in January 1811. In the cane fields, a group of enslaved men gathered quietly, armed with cane knives, axes, and a handful of old muskets. Their plan was simple: march downriver, seize New Orleans, and claim freedom for all. Charles DeLonde, a plantation driver, led the way. As they moved from plantation to plantation, their numbers swelled. Some say as many as 500 joined the march. Flames lit the sky behind them. Sugar houses burned, and the fields that had stolen so many lives were set ablaze. The rebels killed 2 white men, but destroyed 5 plantations and hundreds of acres of crops. For 2 days they advanced, singing war songs and rallying others to their cause. Local militia and U.S. Army troops responded with overwhelming force. The pursuit was relentless. By the end, between 40 and 45 rebels were killed in battle or executed after hasty trials. Their heads were placed on pikes along the levee, a brutal warning to others. 20 years later, Nat Turner, a preacher in Virginia, watched the sky for signs. On August 21, 1831, he and 6 followers began a rebellion that swept across Southampton County. Turner believed he was chosen to lead his people out of bondage. Over 2 days, more than 60 enslaved and free black men joined him. They moved from house to house, killing at least 55 white people before the uprising was crushed. The reprisals were swift and savage. Local militias and mobs killed more than 100 black people, many with no connection to the rebellion. Turner was captured, tried, and hanged. 45 others were executed in the days that followed. These uprisings sent shockwaves through the South, forcing slaveholders to tighten laws and expand patrols. Yet the message was clear. Even in the heart of the system, enslaved people organized, fought back, and risked everything for freedom. Harriet Tubman moved through darkness, her footsteps silent on the frozen ground. She returned to Maryland again and again, leading groups of men, women, and children north. Tubman's roots twisted through woods and marshes, guided by coded songs and the North Star. She carried a pistol for protection and a promise: no one would be left behind. Over a decade, she never lost a single passenger. Each journey meant outsmarting slave catchers, dodging patrols, and trusting a network of safe houses known as stations. The risks were constant, but Tubman's resolve never wavered. Her work on the Underground Railroad freed more than 70 people and inspired hundreds more to seek their own escape. Freedom, though, came with new traps. After the Civil War, old plantations were divided, but land remained out of reach for most black families. Sharecropping contracts replaced chains with debt. Families rented plots and paid landowners in crops, but high interest and rigged ledgers kept them tied to the soil. A bad harvest could erase a year's work. By the 1870s, sharecropping covered the South, locking generations into poverty. The promise of 40 acres and a mule faded, replaced by laws and practices that kept wealth and land in white hands. Yet the fight for rights continued. Black communities built schools, churches, and mutual aid societies. Leaders challenged segregation in courts, decades before Brown versus Board of Education. Still, the wealth gap persisted. Today, the typical white family holds nearly 10 times the wealth of a black family, a legacy rooted in centuries of stolen labor and denied opportunity. The struggle for equality never ended. It changed form. Each act of escape, each field planted, each courtroom battle carried the memory of those who refused to accept the world as it was. Over 12.5 million men, women, and children were forced onto slave ships. Only about 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage. Their labor built the wealth of nations, yet they were denied basic rights by law and custom. The story of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo's abduction in 1731, the Zong Massacre in 1781, and the relentless work of people like Philip Reed and Harriet Tubman reveal both the scale of suffering and the strength to resist. While records document many horrors, countless names and stories remain lost or deliberately unrecorded. The end of legal slavery did not end oppression. Sharecropping, Jim Crow laws, and today's racial wealth gap are direct legacies. Historians continue to uncover new evidence, but not all archives are open, and much remains unknown. Slavery shaped economies, laws, and lives across continents. Remembering these facts honors those who endured, resisted, and changed the world.